They're also poor. Iran is poor. Hamas is poor. They're all poor. And they weren't poor 3 years ago. They were blowing everything up. They're very poor. Do you think Sleepy Joe could have made this deal, baby? Sleepy Joe. I think, do you think he would have made this deal somehow? I don't think so.
Well, Mr. President, one thing I can tell you is we appreciate the help for peace from anyone in America, and we appreciate what you've done enormously.
Yeah.
Mr. President, could you follow up on the idea of what this means to Iran, the pressure?
Pivot of history, and this will be registered in the books, history books. History registers who did what.
Yeah.
I think it does. And it's going to.
Yeah.
Donald Trump has just got the Sudan to basically normalize relations with Israel. So this is Bahrain, and this is also the UAE. And also Saudi Arabia, but maybe not necessarily in these kind of overt terms, but clearly the leadership of Saudi Arabia and Israel seem to be of like minds, especially in the context of working with the United States. So it seems that Donald Trump is calling himself a peacemaker, and in calling himself a peacemaker is basically getting many of the countries in the Middle East to join and formally normalize Israel as a country. Now, there are all sorts of oddities and weirdness with this, and I kind of want to touch into the story because the story is pretty interesting, actually. So the precondition for this to take place from the Sudanese government, it's a new government, and that government basically said, you need to take us off the terror watch list. Now, the reason that they wanted to be taken off the terror list, well, part and part, yeah, it's a transitional government. They don't want to be held to the same standards as the previous strongman. But more importantly, resources that can be dispensed to that country, that cannot be dispensed to that country while it is on that list. So you basically had this negotiation that has taken place where Sudan had to give $335 million, and that money is going to sit in an escrow account. And if it's basically Sudan was found to be helping Hezbollah and Palestinian groups and various bombings that had taken place. So if that money is determined to be awarded to the family, meaning the family will get those funds, and Sudan couldn't necessarily be held to any additional crimes on that very specific instance. I was enamored by that. The amount of stuff that we blow up, the amount of people that we killed, we had drone strikes. There are reportings where 90% of the people that we hit with drones were killed, were civilians at some points. And you think to yourself, we're holding Sudan to this standard. Who holds us to a standard of paying anything off? And in fact, when it had gotten to that point of this notion where we were potentially or allowing families to sue Saudis for 9/11 attacks, Obama recoiled at that because what he understood was if they're going to be held to that standard, what about the stuff that we do around the world? What about the attacks on Syria? What about the attacks in Iraq? What about the attacks in Afghanistan or some of those places in Africa? What about those attacks for people who are just completely innocent civilians? I imagine some of those people get paid, but do all of those innocent people that get killed, do all of the places that get blown up? Of course, the answer is no. But Sudan doesn't have power in this situation. And because they don't have power in this situation, they have to accept what they accept. In this very specific case, they, within a power shift, pulled themselves away from, you could say, Hezbollah in this way, more towards the West and U.S. interests. And that is shown by this. And it's unclear entirely what this means, but this opening of negotiations, or let's say this opening of relations with Israel. I'm going to go into this story because I think the story is interesting. And this is the announcement. And even within that announcement, Donald Trump took the opportunity to put a knife in Joe Biden. Sudan normalizes relations with Israel. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. So the current Prime Minister of Sudan. Thank you so much, Mr. President. We very much look forward to your official notification to Congress rescinding the designation of Sudan as a state sponsor of terror, which has cost Sudan too much. Now, he's responding to this tweet from Trump. This was put out October 19th. Great news. The new government of Sudan, which is making great progress, agreed to pay $335 million to U.S. terror victims and families. Once deposited, I will lift Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list, a long-last justice for the American people and a big step for Sudan. Now, this was being criticized because this money is basically for Americans. This has nothing to do with the African victims who were there. But it's Trump. He says America first, so that's where he's going with this. But the Sudan wanted to make the point that, no, what comes first, precondition, is to get us off that list. Now, egg or chicken, I don't necessarily think the United States cared all that much. Donald Trump wanted his win, and that win was, I want to bring peace to these countries in regards to Israel. At the very least, from the standpoint of leadership and from the standpoint of open negotiations and open trade. I want to make it less hostile. And look, whatever your political designation, I don't think you can say he's failed in this. I think this is one of those things that Donald Trump, to some degree, has some level of success, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. But the question in this, honestly, becomes Iran. What does this mean for Iran? You're creating a power block with these various countries. The catch becomes, what does it mean for the population of those countries? Do the populations of those countries agree with the leadership's positions in regards to making these affiliations with Israel? And beyond that, what does this mean in regards to military security for Iran, that these countries have started to normalize relations with Israel? There's all sorts of questions that start to get asked here at the moment that you start thinking about the permutations and the things that could potentially take place within regards to the society versus the leadership versus the outside interests of the other countries. Not to mention, when a new administration comes in, have a hard time believing that a Democratic administration is going to torch anything that was created from the standpoint of security for Israel. Meaning when Joe Biden comes in, he's not going to deflect from that. He's not going to change that arrangement. That arrangement is probably going to be in place going forward until something takes place that destabilizes those countries where leadership can no longer maintain that tenor. And that's assuming that the relations just works, if that makes sense. Prime Minister gives up the cash. And Trump today tells Congress to remove him from the list. Just like that. Now, some people criticize this because they say $335 million is not enough. And that, fair enough. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump gets what he was going to consider a win. Now, this is weird on a few counts. Sudan was one of the most strident countries back in the Arab-Israeli war. And so the tenor and the change in this is somewhat drastic, especially considering that beforehand you had them more in line with Hezbollah, Palestinian interests, and now for the most part have just basically made a deal with Israel. And again, I stress the leadership is making the deal with Israel. There's something else about this. There's something else. Like I said, removal from the list opens up a ton of cash. It opens up money for them. I think Syria, Iran are the other two countries that are on that terror list. But this frees up cash. I mean, IMF, World Bank, U.S. has its hand in all of these things. And all of these resources are at their disposal the moment that you fall in line and get your mind right. And look, the transitional government in Sudan has a huge order. I mean, there's all sorts of financial distress and everything else in the country that they have to deal with. And honestly, this is one of those things where it's almost impossible for you to ever move fast enough that your public is going to be okay with the movement. Meaning everything is so slow when you're trying to change things, especially when you're trying to change things in this kind of overwhelming way, changing over for somebody who had been there for like 30 years. But in their case, in this government's case, they've clearly chosen U.S. interests. The other part to this, it's unclear entirely what that means to normalize relations. Jordan and Egypt, when I was in both of those countries had normalized relations with Israel. There were certain countries where you couldn't get into Israel and vice versa through. The UAE and Bahrain under Trump had normalized relations with Israel. Again, the question becomes, what does the population think versus what does leadership think? And just like in this country where leadership may take a tenor and a disposition that goes against what their base wants, you may have a situation here with, out of economic interests, or for that matter, political pressure, like I said, economic interest, sweetening the pot for this level of interaction, that you get these guys normalizing relations. UAE, Bahrain, and now Sudan. Yeah. Now to Sudan. What does this mean for Israel? That reporter, astute, asked that question immediately. What does this mean for Israel? And beyond what does this mean for Israel, what do the populations of these countries think? And do the populations agree with the positions that the leaderships have taken in these countries? Meaning these guys were bent into form in order to form these allegiances. And now Donald Trump's argument would be, if I was able to do it, these other blokes, they had all of these years and they weren't able to form the relationships that I was able to form in the Middle East in order to protect Israel. That's his argument. Now, the wild part of this, Israelis love him. If you were ever in Israel, Donald Trump loved the guy. And I suspect they love him for stuff like this. From the standpoint of their security, they think that the opening relations is one of a step forward in that regard. I guess the question becomes, what do their populations think? And do the populations matter? And is it one of those things where the populations don't accept what leadership in those countries decide to do? Now, it may be a situation where the population may not get a vote in that, or the population may not matter in that. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump is trying to bring these countries together. And Sudan is one of the last ones that he's, at the very least, the last one he's bringing into the fold. He's saying that there are going to be additional countries that are going to be added into this. Now, Congress still has to formalize this. But Trump is going to move ahead without Congress on this. And he's already basically made the point of saying this is going to take place. They're taking these guys off the list. The new plan will place the money in an escrow account to be released to the victims when Congress gives Sudan immunity from future legal claims from past terrorist attacks. Congress refused to include the legal protections in the spending bill that was negotiated last week, all but certainly delaying the payout. So understand what that means. Congress still has to approve this. Donald Trump may want to move ahead with this, but Congress still has to give its stamp of approval and say, yes, okay, these guys are off the list. But again, Trump is going through with it anyway. These guys apparently have given the cash up. Let's see, it must be approved. Officials caution that the final... Right, it has to be approved by Trump. Now, I don't think this has any effect on the election. I just don't. I don't think the American public cares about foreign policy in these euphoric degrees where they would see something like this and be like, oh, wow, now that he did that, I'm going to no longer vote for Joe Biden. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. I don't see that happening. I mean, unfortunately for Donald Trump, he wasn't able to push and pursue his case regarding foreign policy, whether it was pulling out of Syria, pulling out of Afghanistan, whether it had to do with not pushing through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, something that I strongly suspect Biden is going to go back to. He had a case to make from the standpoint of foreign policy, even in stuff that I disagreed with, the murder of Soleimani, and how the public gave it like 51% saying okay, which is astonishing and horrifying that the American public would look at that and give that a pass. And yet the American public did. From a standpoint of foreign policy, between the two people, Donald Trump is the stronger candidate. I don't necessarily like what Donald Trump was doing in Venezuela. I don't like what he was doing in Iran, meaning pulling out of the JCPOA. And he caused tens of thousands of deaths in both of those countries from the sanctions that he was putting on those countries. Their inability to get drugs during something of COVID-19 is horrific and disgusting. They're destroying the wheat crops in Syria, again, disgusting and depraved. And yet, between the two, one was trying to get troops out of those countries, where the other one castigated him for trying and even the attempt. One is a war party, which is Democrats, and the other one is also a war party, but at the very least has, let's say, doubts, suspicions, feints to trying to pull those troops out. He never got to make his case. They didn't have the second debate because Donald Trump thought wearing a mask was unmanly. And so he ends up, in a man's way, choking himself to the hospital in an undignified fashion. North Korea, Iran, and Syria are the last three that are on the state-sponsored list of terrorism. And again, it needs to be understood, al-Bashir's government was there, I think, going back to 1998, if I'm not mistaken. And for the most part, that government was collapsed, it was taken out. And the gentleman who was very insistent on getting off the terror list, Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, he was able to accomplish this. This is a win for him, and Trump is considering it a win for himself. I was trying to see if there was anything else. I think that was everything. Yeah, I think that's it. I want to try to get people on to go into the crimes that they're accusing Sudan of in the first place, meaning, like I said, many of the families are saying this is insufficient. But I also want to go into the government prior of the Sudan, and I want to get into the populations and the perspectives of those populations. Because my question becomes whether or not those populations have any say-so in regards to, let's say, pushback. If they greatly disagree with the government, or are those populations basically flaccid? Meaning they may disagree with it, but they keep their mouth shut in their disagreements. In which case, the governments can create these relationships. I would even question whether or not these relationships were taking place behind the scenes anyway. And this became overt all of a sudden, even though these things were, let's say, in back channels, communications were taking place. So, look, whatever you want to think, Donald Trump gets his win. Netanyahu gets what I would imagine in his head to be somewhat of a safer country. That depends on the brinksmanship that goes along with that, of course. And their questions become, okay, you've tied these places together. What does this mean in the context of Iran? And whatever it means, I don't necessarily think it means anything good. I mean, for that matter, can these open relations maintain themselves with brinksmanship against Iran? For that matter, can these relations maintain themselves with hostilities towards Palestinians? An argument can be made that having all of these countries working together in this way may create a chance for actual influence into the affairs of what is going on between Israel and Palestine. It's unclear entirely how this works itself out. I suppose you can take a cynical view of it and say this is basically cowing these countries to allow more belligerence regarding Syria and Iran. But you can also say, well, is it possible that once there's formal relations between the countries, that Israel's behavior is somehow influenced by the relations of those nations? I don't know. And I'm going to bring people on to have the conversation. The main point of this video, though, is just to give a little bit of backstory in regards to the strong man government that was there prior, the transitional government that has taken place, the shift in regards to what seems to be tenor of that government towards Western interests with an alignment with Israel. Donald Trump chest thumping and announcing that Sudan had to pay $335 million, but they wanted to ensure that that payment was disassociated from them being taken off the terror list. Now, again, that's a chicken and egg thing. But either way, Trump has notified Congress that he's taken them off the list. And in being taken off the list, the relations with Israel have now come to fruition. And like I said, all of the questions that are raised, the population's interests, what does it mean for Iran in and of itself? What does it mean for stresses within the context of that particular coalition that they are developing in the Middle East? If they are or is provocation, let's say within Palestine or against Iran, Trump is reshaping the Middle East. And whether this is good or bad, that does seem to be his objective. And he does seem to be accomplishing this objective, at the very least, in optical terms. And that phone call is a real phone call. That person is a real person, meeting the Prime Minister of Sudan. So it's not like he's lying about it. But is this, or does he get bang for his buck for this? Unfortunately, America doesn't entirely care about foreign policy to the degree that they should. And so whether you think this is good or bad, I don't necessarily think it weighs in the election. But Sudan joins the merry band of countries that have legitimized Israel's domination over the Palestinian territories. Like, share, and subscribe.